So what is the security vulnerability, or what is a vulnerability? As I mentioned before, any system or any asset could have a vulnerability, but this vulnerability will be serious if we have a threat that can utilize this vulnerability. And this threat, for example, can be the virus. What is the, let's say, what is the relation between, or what could be one of the vulnerabilities that viruses can utilize it? For example, if I have a system and this system does not have an antivirus solution, in that case, if virus exists, it will simply exploit the system or will take over the system. So in this situation, or in that case, do not have an antivirus is a vulnerability that can be utilized by the virus or by the threat or by the malware. So vulnerability as a technical term, it refers to the flow in the system that can leave it open for the attack. If we have a system that is configured by the default credentials or default authentication credentials, it is a vulnerability. If we have a system that is not using an encryption for encrypting data when it communicates from source to a destination, it is a vulnerability. When we have a building and this building does not have a security or physical security, this is a vulnerability. So vulnerability is not only a technical term, but also can be something related to hardware, to software, to the human aspect. When you have someone who is in charge of security operation and you do not have anyone else to cover his job or do the tasks that he is usually doing, this is a vulnerability as well. So vulnerabilities has some tools or some ways for defining or scoring this vulnerability, because not all vulnerabilities are equal. Vulnerabilities can be scored according to the CVSS scoring system from 0 to 10. And CVSS scoring system, or common vulnerability scoring system, is a way for defining what is the vulnerability criticality and what is the impact of this vulnerability. So, for example, Oracle is releasing from time to time, or every month, they are releasing like a security updates or releasing like a security information related to batches. Why batches are released? In order to cover or batches the security vulnerabilities. And for each vulnerability addressed, we will have like something called as common vulnerability enumeration, followed by the year of identifying the vulnerability, followed by the number or the serial number of the vulnerability. And this CVE value is unique for each vulnerability. So if I have a vulnerability in log4j, I will have a dedicated CVE value for log4j, for example. And in addition to that, I should have the criticality level of this vulnerability, which will be defined by the Common Vulnerabilities Scoring System, or CVSS. So if CVSS is huge, is large number, or is a high number, of course, it indicates that this vulnerability is severe, because it can be attacked with non-experienced attackers. It can be exploited remotely. It can be, let's say, cause a huge damage on the confidentiality, availability, and the integrity of data. So there are some criteria that define how vulnerability can be scored, and CVSS score is one of the vulnerabilities scoring methods. So as we mentioned, threat need to attack the vulnerability, and that's why we use threats in order to initiate the attacks. And when we talk to some kinds of cyber attacks that we might encounter in real life, we can find denial of service attack is one of the common types of performing the attack. What is a denial of service attack? Denial of service attack is kind of cyber attack that utilize a vulnerability in system or resource. But this vulnerability is not related to security configurations or misconfigurations usually. It is related to the resources of the targeted device. Any service or any website or any web application is simply something hosted on a server. And this server has a limited capacity for how much users or how many users this server can handle. This server also has like a limited bandwidth speed or has a limited network speed. And if this network speed or if the amount of transactions exceeded the amount that this server is supporting, the server will crash or at least will stop in serving more additional peoples. And this is the target or the vulnerability which denial of service attacks are usually looking for. Denial of service attack is attack that prevent the authorized users from accessing the service. How it can be done? By multiple of techniques, like subjecting this server to a huge amount of traffic. So no one else will be able to reach this server because basically we consumed all the traffic. Or if this server is supporting like maximum of 1000 concurrent users, I will use an automated tool, and this tool will generate or will mimic the behavior of 10,000 users. So at the end, user or server will not be able to support any future user requests. Denial of service attack is, or DOS, is usually sourced from single source. So we have one cute threat actor, one criminal who is using some tools, and using these tools he is initiating the attack. This can help in detecting those attacks. How? Because any firewall, literally any firewall right now, has the capability for detecting the DOS attack. How? Because firewall can identify what is the source and what is the destination. What is remaining? How many requests coming from this source? If we have 10 requests per second, this might be normal because it is a normal user, so he may be like very fast in clicking or browsing, so it's okay. But if I got like 1000 requests per second from a single user, this is not a normal behavior. That's how firewall can apply some logic in order to detect those attack. The aggressive way of those attack is another attack that use the same logic but called as or named as DDoS attack or distributed denial of service. What is distributed denial of service? It is DOS attack, so it uses the same technique, some automated tool that generate a huge amount of traffic. But instead of having this attack from a single source, we got this attack from millions of sources. So how the third actor can use millions of sources? By using botnet or robot network. How threat actor can create a botnet army by distributing a Trojan horse, viruses, whatever, and eventually by distributing this malware on millions of devices, he can or she can control all of these devices at once and instruct them to initiate a DDoS attack on a particular website, which will lead to having this website down. Is there a protection against DDoS attacks? Of course, we have. But in order to protect against the DDoS attack, you need to do a huge investment in order to have security solution that can deal with DDoS attacks. Because usually the concept or the idea of dealing with DDoS attacks is to create like a scrapping site. And scrapping site is like a data center, and this data center is like a scrap area for malicious traffic. So what happens is we will have a device in our network or in our edge, and this device will start receiving the traffic and do kind of evaluation for the received traffic. If the traffic is within the normal threshold, like we are expecting to have 50,000 users accessing our systems, that's okay, we are good. Traffic can pass and reach our internal systems safely. But if we eventually so that we have 100K in non-peak operation or non-peak time, in that case, this can trigger an alarm. And as a result, we will re-forward this traffic to the scrapping data center. And after cleaning this traffic or after differentiating between what is legitimate and what is illegitimate from this traffic will be forwarded again to our DDoS protection and will reach our server. This could be one of the techniques, by the way, for having a DDoS protection. But as these solutions are very costly, it is usually maintained by the cloud service providers and the service providers. Not every organization or not every business can maintain or can afford having a DDoS protection full-fledged solution to managed by its own. Another kind of attack in cyber attacks is known as buffer overflow attack. And to be more specific, buffer overflow itself is not an attack. It could be a vulnerability or can be a result of a vulnerability or improper software development. The concept of buffer overflow is simply that in any operating system, we have a random access memory called RAM. And this is basic information, by the way. In RAM, we have different spaces or different areas. Some of these areas is accessible by the executable files. Like if I'm running my browser, the opened web pages or the opened tabs are stored in one of the places in the memory, in this area, for example. And the information about these tabs could include the cookies information, the credentials, or whatever sensitive information that might be related to this application. And at any or under any circumstances, this application, which can only access this area of memory, should not go to any other area in memory. Because we might have this area in memory, which is dedicated to system itself or to the operating system kernel. So it could include information related to cryptography or information that is very sensitive or related to system itself. What happened in buffer overflow is we can have a vulnerability in our application, and this vulnerability does not clearly state what are the controls or what are the boundaries between this area and this area, leaving the possibility that if this application send too much data to the RAM, there, an overflow will happen. And simply an overflow is like spilling out the data from this restricted area to another areas. And these other areas could be managed by the system. So what is the impact in that case? The impact will be that the malicious actor, if he managed to execute or exploit buffer overflow vulnerability, he might access unrestricted area in RAM, and they can exfiltrate some data related to the system itself. And they can do kind of software execution or running programs in this restricted area, which mean he or she will run this application with the elevated privilege of the system itself. Because as this area is managed by the system itself, then he will take the permission of the system. This is like an example for what is the buffer overflow attacks. So reason of buffer overflow basically is inadequate secure coding practices. The not using of memory boundaries or boundary check in technical term can cause or can lead to the buffer overflow attack. What is the impact in that case? The impact of buffer overflow attack will be basically threat actor will be able to reach restricted area in memory, and they can utilize this restricted area in injecting some applications or some scripts that can utilize the privilege of the system itself. Usually, as a general security concept, we should apply the least privilege concept. And least privilege concept indicates that if you need to run an application, this application should be run or should run with the limited privilege or the minimum level of privilege. So this is a concept of least privilege. But in case of buffer overflow, we might have the ability to reach the system area in memory, which can give us the opportunity to use the system privilege in order to execute the script and cause more damage. This is the idea behind the buffer overflow attack.